Je m'appelle Fen Hampson, je suis président du Conseil mondial pour les réfugiés et les migrations. Je vous souhaite à tous une chaleureusement bienvenue. Today, as some of you know, is World Refugee Day. Aujourd'hui, comme certains vous le savez, c'est la journée mondiale pour les réfugiés. It is a day when we honor the strength, courage, and resilience of the millions of people who have been forcibly displaced by war and persecution. But it is also a day to remember and mourn those who died on their journey, especially the 700 migrants who tragically lost their lives off the coast of Greece last Wednesday. The World Refugee Council is very pleased to organize this conference in cooperation with our two partners, the Embassy of Ukraine and the Parliamentary Center, on this important day. I would like to recognize and also warmly welcome Mr. Mykola Povranich, who is the Deputy Mayor of Kyiv, who is with us this afternoon. Let me now turn to Mr. Andrei Bukvich, who's the Deputy Head of Mission, Embassy of Ukraine, to deliver opening remarks on behalf of Her Excellency, the Ukrainian Ambassador to Canada, Ms. Yulia Kovalev, who unfortunately at the last minute cannot be with us today. But before Andrei comes up, I'd like to invite Mr. Tom Cormier, President of the Parliamentary Center, to say a few words of welcome. Tom?
Thank you so much, Fen, and Your Excellencies, members of Parliament, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests and friends of Ukraine. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we stand is the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, who have nurtured and cared for this place since time immemorial. Their deep connection to this territory's rivers, forests, and all living beings are a testament to their wisdom and resilience. We will honor these elements during our discussion today, and I ask you to keep that in mind as we hear from our speakers today. I would like to thank FEN and the World Refugee Migration Council and the Embassy of Ukraine to Canada for allowing us to co-host this very important event today. I would also like to thank Parliamentary Center's many sponsors of our Engage Parle Diplo program, which allow us to do this type of partnership. The Parliamentary Center is Canada's global leader for democracy. Nous sommes le leader canadien de la démocratie à l'international. Le Centre parlementaire soutient la démocratie inclusive au niveau national et international depuis 1967. Over the last half century, we have worked to support democratic actors to develop more inclusive institutions in Canada and in over 70 countries and counting. This includes Ukraine. The Parliamentary Center has supported Ukraine's democratic transition for many years. Our Parliamentary Accountability for the Security Sector, Pass Ukraine program, supported by Global Affairs Canada, was designed to promote peace and stability in Ukraine by supporting the Ukrainian Parliament in overseeing and reforming the governance of the security and defense sector. Since the moment of Russia's aggression, we have supported the work of the Ukrainian parliamentarians who are defiantly holding sessions, passing laws, and advancing investigation of war crimes despite Russia's illegal and brutal invasion. We're facilitating important discussions with them in Canada, Ukraine, and in global settings about the need for unprecedented solidarity and unprecedented support and bold action. We're working with our brave partners in Ukraine's parliament and civil society to ensure that Ukraine's democracy is not a casualty of war. According to a study by the Kyiv School of Economics earlier this year, the total damage cost to Ukraine's infrastructure from Russia's illegal and unsanctioned war totals approximately 138 billion, and some have estimated it is well over 400, and it's growing each and every day. In the wake of Russia's brutal war, we have a responsibility to the government and the people of Ukraine to support and preserve their society and livelihoods and their governing political infrastructure. Russia must be held accountable and pay for the destruction it has caused to Ukraine. There can be no impunity for these illegal and barbaric actions. I look forward to the discussions today about the Canadian and global leadership required to ensure this happens. Thank you.
Great. Dear colleagues and friends, honorable members of parliament, senators, distinguished lawyers, on behalf of the people of Ukraine and Ambassador of Ukraine in Canada, Yulia Kovalyev, I would like to thank the World Refugee and Immigration Council, Mr. Aktworthy, Mr. Alan Rock, Mr. Hampson, and the Parliamentary Senator Tom Cormier, my colleagues from the embassy. I'm very honored to be here today among such distinguished and knowledgeable guests. There is a symbolism that we have this panel discussion in advance of Ukraine Recovery Conference in London tomorrow. The name of today's panel is very precise, technocratic, and meaningful: Forfeiting Russian billions to rebuild Ukraine. Why it is important to rebuild or even to remake Ukraine, how to do it. World is changing. The history is not over. The sincere invitation to become a part of democratic world were neglected by authoritarian international actors. They choose to take benefits of democracy like trade, investments, technology, global communications, and disregard the responsibilities like human rights, international law, rules-based order, founding principles of UN and its charter. Instead of refraining from the coercion in international affairs, aggression, intimidation, and violation of human rights, these actors made all these the instruments of their domestic and foreign policy. The growing hostility worldwide challenges us with an adequate global response. Today, it's obvious. It's not enough for peace to watch, tolerate, and reconcile. To be effective and profitable does not help to be safe and protected from aggressive attack. Not doing enough timely means losing your ground, betraying your values, blaming your fellow citizens and the people you represent. Today, Ukraine is becoming a symbol of heroic fight, a fight not for territories or resources, but a fight for freedom, democracy, independence, dignity, and identity. This is a battle that all democratic states fight with us, because the outcomes of this battle have global implication. Ukraine will also raise the symbol of new successful democracy that, together with its allies and partners, fought for a right to be called free and independent state, full-fledged member of European and Euro-Atlantic families. But there is a long way to go ahead of us. We're absolutely grateful to Canada for ongoing and multifaceted assistance, political, military, financial, humanitarian, diplomatic support. We highly appreciate Canada's quick humanitarian assistance response to deliberate detonation on Kakhovska Dam by Russians, which resulted in ecocide and humanitarian disaster of unprecedented scale. We feel the support of the real friends, united by shared values, shoulder to shoulder, we are moving to our joint victory. Unprecedented military assistance, macro-financial assistance, assistance to farmers with their seeds, crops, silos, support for energy security and infrastructure damaged by airstrikes, assistance to small and medium-sized businesses, including women entrepreneurs, demining and clearance of agricultural lands from mines and explosives. The whole free world is helping Ukraine to fight the Russian aggression. Despite all the challenges, we see the results of this titanic work. Russia already has lost in Ukraine, though its convulsions are still deadly. Russians failed to occupy Ukraine in weeks. They were expelled from Kyiv, Chernihiv. They ran away from Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv, Izium, Kherson. They're unable to defend the occupied territories now, as they see Ukrainians coming bravely with the state-of-the-art sophisticated weapons in their hands that is no match to old Soviet rusted metal. But even that rust metal can kill if used against unprotected civilians. It kills massively if upgraded with the modern microchips and electronics that find its way through sanctions and barriers. Nevertheless, every day brings us more confidence. Each inch of Ukrainian territory occupied by aggressor will be liberated by Ukrainian forces, and the territorial integrity will be restored. let me compliment a well-considered approach taken by Global Affairs Canada in imposing restrictive measures which make them highly impactful. A good example is banning the export of almost all services from Canada to oil, gas, and chemical sectors of Ukraine. There's also a very impactful ban in place for import of Canadian technologies and materials to Russian defensive companies. So, next question, why forfeiture of Russian assets is important? It's not only the resources for rebuilding Ukraine, it's also a matter of justice. As war criminals should be brought to justice, the state that launched an unprovoked aggression ought to compensate the material and moral damage done to others. It will be a lesson and warning for any aggressor who would dare following the path of Russia. We are grateful for Canada's leadership in creating an instrument to obtain the resources needed to rebuild Ukraine. Ukraine has adopted legislation that allows us to recover Russian assets on our territory, and we already have many cases of such recovery. Thus, we're grateful for the first two announcements of the seizure of the Russian assets in Canada. We look forward to seeing the results of this mechanism in the nearest future. Canada's first confiscation of Russian assets will be an important step, an example for other countries to adopt a similar approach. The confiscated Russian assets should become a significant source for reconstruction of Ukraine, and the Canadian example should be a case study for our partners to follow. Russia has to pay for its illegal, unprovoked invasion of the sovereign state. Its political and military leadership has to be brought to account in the Special International Tribunal, and all reparations have to be paid to Ukraine through the international compensation mechanism. We have to do this together. We have to do it now, and we have to do it to keep our world secure. And when we look back together in 10 years, we will understand that we managed to build exactly the kind of country that Ukrainians wanted to see. We would be able to maintain the rules-based international order for our children, to live in a democratic world where the international institutions serve the need of humanity and where the freedom and rights have the highest value, worth good fight when time comes. And we're looking forward to the representation of the Honorable Alan Rock and other his colleagues who represent the Canadian legal elite as co-authors of the research paper on forfeiture of Russian sovereign assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine legal principles of countermeasures. This is a very timely and important discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to give you a sense of how we're going to work this afternoon, we have a number of presentations by our legal experts, and then we'll turn to a roundtable panel discussion chaired by the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy with a number of distinguished parliamentarians and others who he will introduce. I would just like to put a couple of numbers in your head, which is always dangerous at the end of a long day. How much money are we talking about when it comes to confiscation? According to a recent study by the Atlantic Council, the Russians have roughly $1 trillion of dark money that's hidden abroad, roughly 1/4 of which is controlled by Vladimir Putin himself. In addition, the Central Bank of Russia has roughly $327 billion that have been blocked in the European Union and G7 countries. That's no small change. The question that we get asked here in Canada is, how much is there here? Well, I think the short answer is we really don't know, because some of that is hidden in real estate holdings and other kinds of investments. But the RCMP has provided us with some figures. There is the equivalent in Canadian dollars of 135,671,000 $222.81 of assets in Canada that have effectively been frozen by our government, and approximately, again in Canadian dollars, $263,795.37 in financial transactions that have been blocked as a result of the prohibitions in the Strategic Economic Measures Act against Russia. Since 2017, the World Refugee and Migration Council has been working on the issue of asset forfeiture to help refugees and those who are victims of human rights transgressions by our own government. Over the years, we've prepared several reports detailing how this could be done through legislation in Canada, led by the Honorable, that work has been led by the Honorable Alan Rock and the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy. With the invasion of Ukraine, the government took renewed interest in our work, and I should have also mentioned that Senator Omadvar played a critical role in introducing legislation, not once but twice in the Senate, to show how the government could forfeit assets, not just of Russians, but bad money that is in Canada. The government, following the invasion of Ukraine, decided last year to introduce new legislation in the form of amendments to SEMA, the Strategic Economic Measures Act, giving it the power to confiscate foreign holdings held in Canada, with I might add, all party support. That was very important in carrying that legislation forward. I'm now going to turn to our four panelists. They have 7 minutes, and I really mean that because we're running over time. And we'll start with Ms. Maria Metsentseva, who is a Ukraine politician and Ukraine chair of the Ukrainian delegation to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. She is kindly substituting for Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Justice, who was supposed to be with us today, who was called into a meeting in London. Maria, over to you, 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, friends. Biggest regards from Strasbourg. We're approaching midnight, but what a wonderful opportunity to address you with something we've been on for the last 15 months of the full-scale invasion. I would say re-aggression, because the first act of aggression occurred in 2014, and it was established in January 2023 by the European Court of Human Rights that the aggression is lasting for more than 9 years. I am pleased to tell you that tomorrow we're meeting your parliamentary delegation as Canada is an observatory state to the Council of Europe, and in Parliamentary Assembly Canadian delegation supports us a lot and speaks in a supportive way on many resolutions. The first external delegation of Ukrainian parliamentarians abroad was confirmed in March 2022 after the full-scale aggression of Russia. And it was 9 women parliamentarians who arrived to Strasbourg, to the Council of Europe, and we excluded Russia back then from the honorable institution dealing with human rights. Indeed, colleagues, I have my speech on the 5 pages, but I think many things have been outlined already, as of to say the Kiev School of Economics estimation, but which doesn't include ecocide figures, which were estimated to 2 billion euros damages before the dam was bombed in Kherson. We can't even imagine what the figures can be right now. And I would like to tell you that with the help of the Council of Europe bravery, we have passed more than 7 resolutions. Another 2 are going to be passed this Thursday. And one of them is actually focusing on the frozen assets and the register of damages. You know, when we introduced this idea together with the Minister of Justice, his team, his first deputy, who was supposed to speak on behalf of Ukraine today, unfortunately, she's in London. Her bravery and the minister's bravery led to the Reykjavik summit declaration, which occurred only fourth time. The summit occurred fourth time in 74 years of the Council of Europe existence, which means that the agenda was pretty much serious. The register of damage will mirror more or less the current amazing work of the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine, which yesterday registered colleagues, and if we talk about figures, 91,505 war crimes. My apartment, which was shelled numerously by cassette rockets in Kharkiv, is not there because I haven't registered this war crime, and I actually should. So the register will be in 3 dimensions. 43 member states of the Council of Europe, including all the members of the G7 countries, have put their signature on creating this registry. So those war crimes registered already will be copied and transferred to The Hague, to the Netherlands. The capacity is there, the instruments are there. Prosecutors at the international level will cooperate on that. You can imagine that the victims, for instance, of the sexual violence, which is yet another war crime, can be in Canada, US, Belgium, Australia, across the globe. And they possibly haven't registered their case as a war crime. This as of to say that we encourage the governments to be a part of the register, to encourage the victims of the war crimes to talk about these crimes and to register them. So 3 pillars, colleagues. International Register of Damage, mirroring the national level, International Claims Commission, which would confirm the amount that might be paid. It also touches upon not only buildings, critical infrastructure, the damages of the areas and regions locally, but also people's losses. As of to say, it might be a loss of a relative or a soldier. So the 3rd pillar is International Compensation Fund. And here we comes to the money. Who should pay for all the aggression, all the war crimes and damages which Russia did to a sovereign state of Ukraine? We think that it has to be Russia. It's not the taxpayers of Canada, of US, of European states, South Africa, Latin America, Australia, etc. Even though the figures you referred to are impressive, you managed to be the first country in the planet Earth to deal with national level and process of seize and pursue of forfeiture of assets belonging to the sanctioned individuals or organizations. And we salute this a lot. We know that there are issues, there are legal issues, so that it can't be revocable in the courts, and it shouldn't be. European Commission hasn't come up with a clear formula for that yet. US has passed several court decisions, for instance, Manhattan Court, when one of the oligarchs' money was transferred directly to Ukrainian government for the reconstruction. We see the figures growing, but we have to enhance international law to make this register working. And I want to thank personally to Jeff for mentioning also the International Tribunal, which Canada is also supporting and is a part of the core group for establishing the International Tribunal for the crime of aggression, because if not the crime of aggression, we would never see those war crimes, numerous war crimes we're dealing with, and there wouldn't be any necessity for the register. When we were initiating as parliamentarians of the 46 member states of the Council of Europe, supported by observer states like US and Canada, the register, we were basing our initiative solely on a parliamentary level. Then ministers of the 46 member states were agreeing to proceed with the conference. And now, colleagues, I can reassure you that there will be allocations of funds for this fund, for the register to be operating. and it touches upon every victim, every family in Ukraine to not only receive the compensation. This is not about the money. How can we assess a loss of my close friend who gave his life for Ukraine, for its independence and freedom and the values we all believe in? I don't think there will be an amount we can which can trigger this loss. Same goes to every family loss which we have in Ukraine. Therefore, the purpose of it is, of course, the justice to prevail, because the justice protracted is the justice rejected. And colleagues, there is no other way of, I am finishing. There is no other way to progress unless we unite further actions, we follow the Canadian experience, and we use with a very solid law formula the frozen assets for the compensations. Thank you for your support. Tomorrow we're looking forward to meet your delegation in the Council of Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria. We're joined by Philip Zelikow in London, I believe. He is on the video, Jeff. And Philip, we're going to turn things over to you because we know it's late. You've been speaking in London where you're attending the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference, I believe speaking to the Churchillian Society by the looks of it. So over a few bios, by the way, are on the sheet. I'm not going to introduce anyone. Over to you, Philip.
Sure, thanks. I don't know how far along this group is into the details of this, and I'm happy to go really deep on the professional issues involved in how to do this. Let me just make, I published an article in Foreign Affairs on Thursday with Larry Summers and Bob Zellick that makes a pretty strong strategic and policy case and goes through some of the legal issues. Let me go ahead and make 5 quick points that are just introductory, and we can take this in as much depth folks want. First point, this is not an issue, well, the overarching observation is that it is a circumstance unique in history that the country carrying out the largest aggression since 1942 left the means to compensate its victims in banks of countries that are law-abiding and oppose them. This is such an extraordinary circumstance. Just have to pause and reflect on that for a moment. And kind of the issue really now is, gee, can we figure out some way to capitalize that? Yes, is the answer. Point 1 is this is commonly thought of as an issue for the post-war. Actually, it's an issue at the center of the war. The center of gravity in the war is Ukraine's staying power and its political and economic viability. Everyone is riveted by the headlines about the tanks and the missiles on the front lines. They are missing the fact that Russia is running a strategy of an attrition war of ruin that's designed to slowly bring Ukrainians to a position of despair, where its 13 million displaced people don't really come home. Its private sector never really gets repaired, and the partners eventually begin to start running low on the staggering amounts of money they're appropriating every day just to keep the Ukrainian government afloat. So point 1 is the political and economic staying power is actually at the center of the war effort, not something for way later. Point 2, the effort to Ukraine properly understood would be understood as actually the new European recovery plan. If you put hundreds of billions of dollars and euros into the reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine, that is a gigantic program that will have rippling effects across that entire half of Europe. Most of the orders will go into the rest of Europe. It will revitalize the whole European project by lashing that into the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. So if you understand that this is actually the new European recovery plan of this generation, rather than some sort of foreign aid charity effort for Ukraine, I think that's a much more powerful way to frame the argument on both sides of the Atlantic. Third point, a lot of people for a year were hung up on how to do this legally. Actually, I think, frankly, the international law approach for how to do this has essentially been solved now. The fundamental point is that everyone was staying in a sanctions paradigm. In a sanctions paradigm, you honor your legal obligations to the country while you lock it up, so to speak. It's what we need to do now is move from the international law of sanctions to the international law of state countermeasures, which is a well-established area of international law we have done before, including to aggressors. And we just need to now move to that phase. In that phase, you basically say to an outlaw, you're not entitled to the respect, we don't have to respect our legal obligations to you if you don't respect your legal obligations to anybody else. And so we suspend our regard for the state immunity of your assets while you're such an international outlaw, and we're going to transfer the money. We did that before, actually, in the case of Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait. We went through a sanctions phase, then we moved to countermeasures, and we transferred the money to compensate the victims in like $50 billion. This is a vastly greater case in every way and a much more extreme aggression. It's an extreme thing to do. The Russians ordinarily would be able to come at us and ask for compensation. And the defense, by the way, and under the international law of state countermeasures is, no, you don't get compensation if you committed a grave breach of a peremptory norm of international law, and our response to this breach is proportionate. These are not hard criteria to meet in this case. You've already got an International Court of Justice ruling and a UN ruling. It's a voluntary measure taken by relevant states. As I say, there are precedents for this. So when you work this through and just tell people it's time to move to countermeasures, international lawyers who are knowledgeable don't really have an answer to that. The answer is that you can't use countermeasures. Then they fall back on the policy arguments. I've been in a lot of conversations about this, and once you get them to countermeasures, then they say, well, we shouldn't do the countermeasures. And then let me go, then my fourth point is about the policy arguments. They make two weak arguments and one real argument. The first weak argument they make is a lot of concerns about the dollar and the euro. And if we did this, no one will put their money in dollar holdings or euro holdings anymore. Now, this is why my co-authors, Larry Summers and Bob Zellick, who I think are not regarded as inexperienced in international finance, joined me on this. In fact, in our article, we spent a couple of pages just knocking the dollar argument to pieces. But and actually, Summers and Zellick thought that I had spent too much time on this by spending 2 pages on it in the draft. They said, you're dignifying this silly argument by spending 2 pages on it. We should have done this in 1, but we left it at 2. When you go into the, it's a superficially plausible argument, but if you actually go into the argument in some detail and understand exactly why people hold money in dollars, how they've already priced in political risk, and a variety of other things. By the way, there are some precedents for when the Russians tried to pull their money out of dollars in 2018. The dollar argument just kind of goes away. It's the kind of argument that sounds good until you do the analysis. The second weak argument is, oh, well, if aggrieved countries can just take people's money, aggrieved countries all over the world will take our money. The problem with that argument is actually aggrieved countries all over the world have been trying to do this to us for generations. The reason they don't do it, put it in shorthand, is they don't want to be Venezuelan. There's a longer version of the argument, but it's not because they like us. A lot of property has been nationalized, but they usually decide they need to compensate. So then you come to the real argument. The real policy argument is they're afraid of Russian retaliation. And here's one of the ironies, or one of the key points, is the Russians actually have already adopted state countermeasures. We haven't. The Russians started doing this with a presidential decree 7 weeks ago in late April. And the Russians then said, we're going to adopt as a state countermeasure to your freezing our assets, we are now going to essentially liquidate the ownership of a couple of foreign, and they did it illegally. Instead of going after our state assets, they went after private property. And they took over a Finnish company and a German company just to show they could, and claiming it as a state countermeasure, to which we then made no response at all. We're suggesting that we actually do a lawful state countermeasure against Russian state property. But the fear of Russian retaliation is real, but the Russian retaliation is already happening. They are already nationalizing our properties on a large scale, as you can see. And what's really going on here in the fear of retaliation is there are some countries that have not yet really, at their hearts, accepted that they're going through a painful economic divorce from Russia. It's kind of like we've accepted that there's this really unpleasant separation and a lot of ill will, but they haven't really quite stepped up to the fact that this is going to be a painful divorce, and that a lot of this and a lot of the holdings in Russia are going to be nationalized. But I think if that's going to happen, and actually we should set up a claims process to manage that. So the fourth point I wanted to make was there are policy arguments. 2 of them are weak and 1 of them is real. But then you just accept that as the trade-off, like, okay, so do we let Ukraine now die while we, and so then you turn to the 5th argument, the last observation I'm going to make is, why don't we just delay? Why don't we just kick this down the road and just do this next year or something? And let me just make a few points about that.
Very
First.
few, Philip.
I will.
Thanks.
No one has a plausible scenario in which the Russians get the money back. So if the Russians aren't going to get the money back, essentially we are holding this money inert, unwilling to mobilize it while the Ukrainian economy dies. So, and meanwhile, if the policy of delay plays into Russia's strategy of ruin, attrition, and wreckage. And if you want to get a huge program underway by next year, a huge program that has to link big public money to big political reform, to big private investment all together in the design, it's an extremely elaborate design that no one has begun working on because they haven't crossed the first step. And that design to be ready next year, we need to get going on it now. I'll stop there and thank you for your patience.
Thanks so much, Philip. Alan, Rock, you're next.
Honorable members of Parliament and members of the Senate, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I have 7 minutes, but I'm getting the message from Fen, it better be a short 7 minutes. So let me get right to the point. Canada has led the world. We all agree, I don't think anybody's going to disagree, that Russia should pay for the consequences of this conflict. And that payment's going to be enormous, as has been suggested. Canada led the world last year when Parliament adopted legislation that went beyond sanctions, that went beyond freezing assets, and created a regime by which the government can go to court and get an order from a judge authorizing the confiscation of those assets, their liquidation and repurposing. The legislation specifically says it's for cases of gross violations of human rights and violations of international peace and security. In other words, it contemplates specifically the case of the invasion of Ukraine. And this model is being examined closely. This conference, which starts tomorrow in London, will very much focus on the Canadian model and examine the question how it can be imported elsewhere so that the domestic laws of all of those countries who are supportive of this proposition that Russia ought to pay have in their own jurisdictions lawful authority for the confiscation and repurposing of assets. Now, the paper we've put before you elaborates at length upon the legal analysis of this initiative. And it makes the case that the legislation adopted by Parliament last year is fully valid, that it can be implemented in a manner that's lawful in relation to Canadian laws, And then it goes on to say that there is a sound basis in international law for doing this as well. Now, in my 3 minutes, I'm going to confine myself to the Canadian domestic legal issues, and my colleague and friend, Professor Rob Curry, is going to deal with the international dimension. Let me speak then quickly about why the legislation that Parliament adopted last June is indeed valid. First of all, let's consider the question of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 8 of which prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. At the time that the Parliament acted, there were lawyers in the media suggesting that this would be unreasonable search and seizure, to which I say that is not so. If you look at the jurisprudence in the Supreme Court of Canada, which has had many opportunities to consider and interpret Section 8 of the Charter, you'll see the hallmark of validity in search and seizure is reasonableness. And one of the principal determinants of reasonableness is whether there is judicial intervention and supervision for the seizure. Well, this legislation specifically provides that the government must go to court, must persuade a judge on the evidence that the property in issue is that which is described in the freezing order and is owned by the party named in the proceeding, who, by the way, is given notice of the proceeding. So the central element, the reliability, the openness, the transparency, the judicial supervision of the process is the first and very complete answer to the suggestion that the legislation is in contravention of Section 8 of the Charter. There's another Canadian legal issue that I should deal with just as I close, and that has to do with the Sovereign Immunity Act. Canada, like other countries around the world, has adopted legislation which protects other states from the jurisdiction of our courts. In other words, we make it impossible for citizens or others to go to our courts and sue other states. So we immunize them from the court's jurisdiction. Now, the Sovereign Immunity Act specifically says that Canadian courts will not have jurisdiction over other states, nor can Canadian court orders be executed against the assets of foreign states, including central bank assets of the other states. So this, on its face, looks to be an impediment to what we wish to do. And we offer 4 answers to that in the paper, and let me briefly summarize. Say, first of all, the Sovereign Immunity Act is a statute of Parliament, can be amended, and given the political circumstances and the moral imperative of acting as we propose, I can imagine an amendment to the Sovereign Immunity Act with broad support in the House and Senate that would exempt Russia from its application in these circumstances. But beyond that, I suggest as well that the government has a choice when it comes to confiscating and liquidating Russian state assets. We can use the legislative regime which triggers the court's involvement for private assets, the yachts, the shares held by the oligarchs, the fancy houses that they've purchased. We can use the court process for them. But there's ample precedent for moving against the state assets by executive action. And that does not engage the courts, and therefore the Sovereign Immunity Act is not involved. And some may say that's too cute, but we have an additional answer that Rob will develop more fully when he speaks, and it was adverted to by Philip on the video, and that is countermeasures. In other words, if Russia were to come forward and say, well, by confiscating and repurposing our state assets, you have violated our rights under the Sovereign Immunity Act, the response we would give is that suggested by Philip. It does not lie in your mouth to complain about your rights in law not being respected when you, as a state, have violated the most fundamental precept of international law, the cornerstone provision in the Charter of the United Nations, by unlawfully invading another country. So you will not be heard to complain about the application of the Sovereign Immunity Act. For all of those reasons, we say that that statute is not an impediment to what we propose. And we say that from a domestic law point of view, Canada has put in place, Parliament has put in place legislation that contemplates and permits what we propose. And I now invite my colleague and friend Rob to deal with the international aspect, to persuade you, as we hope to do in the paper, that our proposal is also consonant with international law. Thank you. Rob.
Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure and an honor to address you folks here today. I do get to pick up on the second half of Alan's presentation, which is the international law piece. And I'm going to echo a couple of things he said and a couple of things that Professor Zelikow said. We know from everything we know about adult pedagogy is you have to hear it 3 times before you understand it. So I'm number 3. And I will make a few points about the international law context of Canada's measures, bearing in mind that while Canada was first out of the gate here with confiscation measures, we are currently in good company. There are like-minded, friendly countries out there taking similar measures, looking at the possibility of similar measures, including our friends in the UK, the US, and the European Union. Let me start with the seizing and freezing of assets itself under the Special Economic Measures Act. It's always worth making the point when we talk about that level of activity, which is sanctions, that sanctions are not in and of themselves illegal under international law. They're a common tool of foreign policy. As we say in the paper, certain kinds of sanctions may very well be illegal because of their scope or their function, but our starting point is there's no international law prohibition on the use of sanctions. Quite the contrary, we see a lot of it. Now here, regarding the assets of private individuals, what we have, as Ambassador Rock explained, is forfeiture by way of a public but non-criminal law process, which rests on a finding by cabinet that a foreign state or its nationals are implicated in a breach of international peace and security, gross and systematic human rights violations, or acts of major corruption. It's analogous to, but different from, the civil forfeiture of proceeds of crime, which has a much lower standard of proof and a long and solid international law pedigree. Now in the paper, moving on to another sort of area of international law, we do flag that there may be some issues from an international investment law point of view. There is a Canada-Russia BIT, bilateral investment treaty, that is several decades old. It does not have an exception for matters of international peace and security, as more modern treaties do, which might otherwise have provided an arguable defense. So what does that mean? We might see Russian investors bringing arbitration claims under that treaty and its implementing legislation. Our thought there is that this might very well have to be fought out in arbitration, but it is by no means obvious that Canada is in a weak position. Much would depend on how much of the surrounding context the arbitrator could take into account, which would itself be the subject of argument. Importantly, neither the government of Russia nor the oligarchs would be coming to the table with clean hands, and that could make a decisive difference in those kinds of matters. Now, the situation with state assets is a bit more tricky, but as Professor Zelikow proposed, there is a solution. And as Alan noted, from a domestic law point of view, under the State Immunity Act, Russian state assets would be immune from forfeiture and the court process that surrounds it. This is particularly so with Russian central bank property, which is kind of at the core of state immunity in international law. Now, as Alan said, there is a solid argument that as a matter of international law, that immunity applies only to judicial proceedings and not to executive action. It's a little bit controversial. It hasn't been tested that much, but it's a solid argument. So it's possible it would be simply legal to confiscate the assets and sell them by way of order in council. However, and this is where I'm shifting to the countermeasures point, because to the extent that anything Canada has proposed here and put into action is illegal from an international law point of view, Canada has opened to it the defense of countermeasures. There's been a lot of talk about this recently. I will go over the broad strokes here. The idea behind countermeasures is that when a foreign state is breaching an international law obligation owed to Canada, then Canada can, in response, breach another rule of international law, or possibly more than one, as a means of pressuring the foreign state to stop its breach. So practically, here, Russia has breached the obligation not to wage aggressive war and invade other states. While Canada was not invaded, this is what's called an erga omnes obligation, meaning it's an obligation owed to every other state in the world. So Russia owes it not just to Ukraine, but to Canada as well. Canada is an affected state, and we're entitled to invoke countermeasures as a result. Now, there are certain requirements. Professor Zelikow mentioned them. Notification, which has pretty much been accomplished by the United Nations putting Russia on notice, and that the measures have to be proportional. Canada's best bet with regard to state assets, particularly monies held in Canada, if any, belonging to the Russian Central Bank, would be to invoke countermeasures and suspend the sovereign immunity that would attach to the assets. At that point, Russian state property would no longer be immune. Canada would be free to freeze and to seize it. Now, how do we accomplish that? Again, I'm going to repeat a couple of points. Arguably, as soon as Canada has formally invoked countermeasures, it has done so under international law, because this area of customary international law actually is automatically part of Canadian domestic law. So the seizure could just happen by way of order in council. That said, this is Canada. We tend to prefer more concrete ways of taking action, including international law actions. So the best idea, as Alan suggested, probably is to amend the State Immunity Act to the effect that immunity is suspended vis-a-vis Russian state property. Now, countermeasures do have to be reversible, on the other hand. So it's arguable, what do we do with that? Does that take forfeiture off of the table, at least regards property, because once you sell it, it's gone? So this is the final piece. When the Russian state assets are seized, rather than to forfeit them, a good plan, and the plan that's being formulated internationally, is to transfer the assets into an escrow account, because the whole point of this is to amass a body of resources to facilitate the rebuilding of Ukraine. This would allow Canada to take part in the proposal made originally by the UN General Assembly and referred to by Ms. Mezentseva earlier, which is that there be a claims commission or tribunal set up to funnel Russian property to Ukraine by way of damages as a remedy for its illegal actions. So that's Canada seizing assets, putting them in the pot of funds that will be internationally administered in such a way that they can rebuild Ukraine. That'll be put together by way of international agreement, and as Professor Zelikow mentioned, there are precedents. This is not unknown territory. It can be done. So to sum up, seize and forfeit the oligarchs' property and repurpose those proceeds to rebuild Ukraine. Seize and hold Russian state property until it can be deposited into an international mechanism that will dispense the funds to help Ukraine. Impunity for the lawbreaker, Russia, is defeated. That's the Canadian plan.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ms. Alison Lawton, who is going to speak to the modalities of philanthropic engagement in mobilizing resources to help Ukraine. She does have PowerPoint, and you'll be able to see it on either screen.
I guess I'm the only one going kind of old school on this. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to take this down to the granular level, out of the legalese of all of this, and talk about what happens when we have the funds available and how do we distribute them. We've stated most of what's up here on the PowerPoint. I had an old stat of $123 million worth of Russian assets that are frozen. But I think the more important piece now is what do we do moving forward? How do we design a mechanism where we could hold the funds, administer the funds, and allocate those pool of funds where required? Clearly, this is something we need to do in the most efficient and impactful way, and we need to take social impact into consideration. So when we started our design thinking into a fund that would be a starter fund before we head to a global fund, we looked at the Paris Agreement, so the Treaty for Peace in Italy from 1947. We looked at the Kuwait Compensation Fund. And then we've also looked at the Canadian government's funds to support social impact investment, so Grand Challenges Fund and the Equality Fund. All of those funds have really interesting structures and different ways of working and collaborating with philanthropic communities, NGOs, and international organizations. So the uniqueness now is really to create a trust fund that's more of a reparation fund that blends the best of both the traditional alongside with social impact. With a social impact fund, we look at issues like reintegration and rehabilitation. We look at trauma and healing. We consider education, work skills, peace building, and conflict for communities. And we, as well as infrastructure, housing, and microfinance loans. All while, focusing and championing the rights of the most vulnerable: women, children, LGBTQ persons, persons with disabilities, and veterans. Clearly, we would need Ukrainian involvement in this design, development, and ultimately the distribution of the funds. Some of the main objectives that we have yet to consider that we'd need to consider alongside Ukrainians would be who and what qualifies, where and how will those investments be made? And how do we ensure maximum flexibility so that we can invite other partners to collaborate? But ultimately, how does the average Ukrainian benefit from these funds? Mostly looking at parameters around good governance, accountability, transparency, and how do you measure social impact success is pretty standard when you set up of these funds. The unique piece is a collaborative piece. We can't just set up a fund and do it independently. We definitely need to consider how other organizations would become involved. The fund, from a practical perspective, would need to be populated with $100 million at minimum, just for the basic operating. And it would be governed by trust fund managers and social impact experts. And this is a kind of an architecture of how the funds would be administered into a trust. Then you'd have an operating entity, which is very typical in the fund industry, where you have a management fee of 2.5% to 3%. You have two distinct diverse board of directors. Each would be domiciled in Canada. And then we'd have two distinct teams. And those teams would issue small social impact grants, $50,000 to $200,000 each, maybe about $50,000 annually. And then you'd have an investment team, and they would be issuing much larger grants, and those grants would be more in an investment style, and they'd be $1 to $5 million, maybe 2 to 3 annually. Just to define the difference between social impact grants and investment, some of this may be obvious to some of you. Well, social impact grants are grants. There's no expectation of any type of return outside of can we measure whether the grant has been impactful. Those would be programs, again, that I've mentioned: rehabilitation programs, health and wellness programs, educational work skills development, and really economic empowerment for citizens. There's some really great examples of how that's already been done around the world. One that I wanted to highlight was an NGO-funded grant model that trained medical professionals so that they could provide mental health services to survivors of a conflict in the Eastern DRC. And then the other side is the investment side. So how do we generate, financial returns for the Ukraine as well as social impact? And that would allow us to invest in social enterprise and business development in the Ukraine, provide microfinance loans, and support housing developments. Again, lots of great international examples of this, where a global innovation fund has provided money for solar initiatives in India to provide farmers with solar capacity to increase the farming opportunities. Clearly, it's already been said that it's time to take a proactive role in the designing of a fund. I think now is the time that we can really start to dig in, to look at the different architecture and work with various different philanthropic organizations, international agencies, and see where we can strengthen our capacity and outreach. And clearly, the concept would only be successful in collaboration with Ukraine's. We hope that this model would be something that would be replicated. If we could design it now and get it out to the forefront when it comes time, other countries can really quickly adopt it. And then long term, this would probably be folded, as already been stated, into a global fund. So thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions, we're going to be available after.
Thanks very much, Alison. And I'm now going to invite the members of our next panel to come up. We have a star-studded panel chaired by Lloyd Axworthy, Alexandra Chijij, who's president of the Ukraine Congress, Heather McPherson, the MP from Edmonton Strathcona, Michael Chong, MP, Wellington Halton Hills, Senator Umedvar, who's also a council member, and Ryan Turnbull, who's the MP from Whitby. You'll notice I did not say what party they're with because we're having a nonpartisan discussion up here. So.
I don't always wear orange, but today I just thought I would. Sometimes I wear red. I can wear them all. Anne's got orange and red on.
Yeah, they're all really
Very heavy chair.
Share your mic with me.
Is it on? Yep.
You'll notice that the little gimmick of bringing the chair was just to prove the parliamentarians know how to count, especially with by-elections and things like that. I want to welcome our panel. Finn gave the very briefest of introductions, but I want to really say how much I appreciate your involvement, because I think we're now into that very kind of crucial stage where you move from an idea, an analysis, an argument, a conversation to action. And I would think that that is probably the stage where we're at. And I think listening to the comments that were in the first panel. We're actually at a junction point as the aggression continues and the Russians continue to their sort of unholy effort to just undermine the humanism of Ukraine. I think it's important that new energy, new agency be injected into the debate. And I think it's been important to know that as Canadians, we're at a position where we can provide that leadership. And it's come very much through the parliamentary system. Senator Odovar's introduction of a bill into the Senate as a model, picked up as a member of the part of the Budget Implementation Act with all party support. You know, I am old school, but Parliament is the source of agency in this country when it comes to direction. And that's why I think it's really important in this discussion to be able to look at how do we mobilize, how do we energize, how do we sort of, I was going to use the Republican word weaponize, but that would probably be a little bit going too far. It's a way of actually converting the fundamental concept of repurposing and the forfeiture of assets into direct, meaningful impact on individuals in Ukraine and of the willingness of the rest of the world to continue to see that there are new ways, innovative efforts to provide a broader countermeasure, a broader strategic view. The Russian strategy has been well practiced throughout the world, Syria, Chechnya, which is let's just try to destroy the will of people. I think what we're now talking about is let's destroy the sense of confidence and arrogance of those who control the assets by making sure that their piggy banks are no longer protected and that they're going to have to start fessing up. There's an old children's story who makes the case. It's called Robin Hood. And when the sheriff of Nottingham, who commits the crimes, you find a way to make sure that the people who have been victimized get the return. And I know that doesn't quite fit with the very intricate legal arguments we've heard, but it really does come to the point that we are now talking about political action. I really want to address to this panel and to yourselves, what are the next steps? How do we take where we're at now, where there's legislation, where the legal sort of brushwork has been cleared up, and realize that there is now, within months, I would say, an important platform for energizing, and that we're kind of just simply take a lead. What we can do by ourselves is useful. What we can do as the sort of organizer of a collaborative international effort is monumental. And I think that's the kind of political call to action that we would like to discuss and taking these ideas. So I'm going to, and we have an incredibly interesting panel. I mean, I wouldn't say it's nonpartisan, but let's just say it is cordially that way, which I always thought was the way Parliament should operate. So I'm going to actually, Senator, can I start with you, because you introduced into the Senate based on the idea that had been worked on, and what you feel then is, from your perspective, should happen in terms of parliamentary action to get this thing moving.
Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you for hosting this important event. I should start by giving credit where credit is due. The thought leadership and the innovation surrounding this proposal came from the World Refugee and Migration Council, which you founded, Lloyd. I was merely the legislative tool in a way, but now it is a very big part of my legislative life. I believe that we found a moment in time, because politics is often all about timing. The first time I tabled the bill in 2019, it got some interest, but not much traction. And then in 2021, it was tabled again, and the war in Ukraine had just been declared, and you got, Lloyd, widespread all party support, although there were some substantive objections made at committee. I should welcome actually my colleague Senator Dasko and Senator McFedrin, who both supported me significantly. And in fact, Senator Dasko and I commissioned a public opinion poll last year, which found that 90% of Canadians, a really high figure, supported the measure to confiscate, to seize and confiscate and repurpose the assets. So your question as to what should happen next, there are two cases in Canada. First, the seizure and confiscation of Roman Abramovich's assets, $26 million. And the next case is the seizure of the cargo jet more recently. I believe the way these two cases will go with court proceedings, as Alan described them, will prove to us, will provide proof of concept for not just for Canada, but for the rest of the world. The rest of the world is watching. I know that there are legal challenges to both these seizures, and they will have to work themselves out. We are a country of law and order, and whilst I'm interested in the notion of executive order for seizure of state assets, I believe in the realm of individual assets and state entity assets. We're well served by this law. We just have to now wait and see what transpires. Looking further down the road, Lloyd, I would say we have to have a mechanism for repurposing the assets in a transparent and accountable way, not so that they could be corrupted again. We've had that experience with repurposing assets to Libya, where billions of dollars just got re-corrupted again. That's not the intention here. So I look forward to the discussions, and I welcomed the idea of a Ukraine reconstruction fund surrounded by international governance with transparency and accountability built in. But I think the primary goal should be to get the money as soon as we can to the victims who are suffering now. Let's not wait for Russia to pay later. Let's make Russia pay now. And that's the purpose.
Maybe I could take your remarks and go to Alexandra, who represents what has become the powerful voice of civil society of Ukrainian Canadians. But for many of us, Alexandra, I think the Congress has really spoken broadly from a large sort of cadre of Canadians. And your leadership has really been important. And so from the constituency that you serve across the country, what would be your advice to the members of parliament who are here?
Well, first of all, let me start by thanking our host today for this very, very important conversation. And I think we've heard a lot of advice and good strategies today. The importance of moving this forward now cannot be overemphasized. Ukraine cannot be allowed to drown while we wait for the end of the war. And the pain for the aggressor must be felt immediately. As Senator Omidvar has said, we have started the action against Roman Abramovich. We are confiscating that famous landmark in Toronto that has sat at Pearson Airport and amused many of us for some time. But I would like to see the executive action taken, because that would be perhaps a faster track, and not to decry the need for due process in our courts. As a lawyer, I have to support due process, but I think some quick action would be beneficial at this time, because we need to send that message to Russia soon, and the sooner the better.
Ian, I'm going to go to you next. There is a certain precedence, I guess, of government and others, but which I have to acknowledge because it's an old habit. Yeah, and I know that you have been really promoting an idea of a bond kind of issue as one of the options. Could you but as a member of the of Parliament and someone who's taken very clear interest and involvement publicly, what's your sense of where Canadians are on this?
Well, thank you for the question. I guess for me, the general interest of the public, I think, is there. I think Canadians generally stand in solidarity with Ukrainians. I think to date, I feel that Canadians are impatient. They want to see more progress on behalf of Ukraine, and I'm sure they want to see them win the war. But they also, I think, want to see us acting in a way that truly mobilizes the assets and the capital required to assist Ukrainian refugees to return home as soon as possible. But I think also just really ensure that we stand behind human rights and the international rules-based order. And I think there's quite a few proposals. I'm the chair of a social innovation caucus. I came to this conversation a little bit late after talking with Senator Ahmedvar. We're looking at ways that so we can look through a social finance lens and look at unique tools that may be able to mobilize capital faster. Certainly, I understand from the legal papers that have done, a lot of the legal questions have been coming up, and those have really held us back. So I'm really happy that we're here today and that there's sort of a clear, semi-clear, I think, path. It's becoming more clear, let's say, how we move forward. And that's not to say that it's not without its challenges. I wonder about the timeline for that. And I wonder whether there are opportunities to leverage the value of the assets in order to use them as collateral to issue something like an international peace bond. And so we've been working on this concept through the Social Innovation Caucus for about 5 months with civil society organizations, and we've engaged with quite a few people across the globe that are interested in that concept, and look forward to maybe at a future date sort of revealing more about that. But I think it's got a lot of potential. In particular, the reversibility of the countermeasures, I think, is kind of an interesting, if you don't actually liquidate the assets and put them in a special purpose vehicle and use the value of those assets to issue a bond that is semi or fully guaranteed by governments around the world that stand in solidarity to support Ukraine, I think you could really engage the private sector in investing in Ukraine's future and mobilize, capital quite quickly with the bonds structured in a way that, you could deduct what Russia owes in the future from those reparation payments that are awarded in who knows how long from now, that you could deduct the amount from that bill.
Thanks, Ryan. Michael, can I go to you? And you're the critic on global affairs, so you bring that great horizon view. How do you see this being played out as kind of taking a role? Is this something that we're capable of? Is this something that will have backing? Is this something that you think is a moment whose time has come?
Well, I think we've taken a leadership role within parliamentary democracies. To my knowledge, we're the first parliamentary democracy that has enacted legislation in this regard. Republican forms of government have long had executive power that authorized them to seize and to freeze and seize and repurpose assets. I think of what happened in 1981 with the presidential order with respect to Iran. I think about a recent example that was mentioned in earlier discussions with the invasion by Iraq of Kuwait, when President Bush in 1992 issued an executive order to seize and repurpose $50 billion for the benefit of Kuwait. So I think amongst parliamentary democracies, we're setting a precedent that I hope other parliaments will enact. I think that it's clear that if Ukraine is truly going to win this war, it's going to have to rebuild as part of that winning. If you look at the Russian economy, it's barely suffered a blip since the invasion began on February 24th. Their GDP has barely been affected. In fact, their oil and gas revenues have swelled. There's some $100 billion that have been transferred from allied democracies into Russia due to its sale of oil and gas, and they've had no problem finding markets for it. Ukraine, on the other hand, has seen a flight of about a third of its population, mostly into Western Europe. It's seen a decline in its GDP of a third, and we all know the mass destruction that's taking place. And so Russia's experienced going to be at least $400 billion US dollars in reconstruction aid, infrastructure aid that's going to be required. And that does not, by the way, include the 4 oblasts in the eastern part of the country and does not include Crimea. This is just $400 billion for the territorial possession that Ukraine currently controls. And so where is that money going to come from? Well, I think as some other speakers have mentioned, there's plenty of precedent for this. Look, both the Soviets and the Allies bombed the hell out of Germany during the Second War. And after the Second War, the United States led with the Marshall Plan. And that was roughly $200 billion US dollars that the US government committed to the reconstruction of Europe. Other allies did the same, and obviously the Soviets also did the same in their sectors of control. Maybe not quite to the same extent, but they still did that. And so that is a precedent that was set. And I think Iran, Kuwait, countermeasure arguments, Russian Federation being the first bad actor moving with an illegal act, I think there's plenty of precedent for us to seize and repurpose state assets. And I'll finish by saying this, that in some ways, this is a relatively easy argument for us to make as Canadians, because there's not a lot of Russian state assets frozen in Canada. The reality is that of the 300 billion US dollars that have been frozen, most of that comes in the form of euros, and most of that sits in Belgium's zero clearing house. And so, I welcome our move here to lead on this legislation, but the difficult decisions will have to be taken by European and American and British and Japanese governments.
But on that point, there have been times in the past where Canada isn't necessarily carrying the heavy load, but it does take the first load and therefore takes the initiative. And Heather, I mean, first, in your beloved city of Edmonton, there's a lot of Ukrainian Canadians who are clearly quite passionate about this. What's your sense? Is there a willingness, though, to see Canada step out into that kind of proactive role of really not just sort of going along or being compatible, but actually saying, we will take an action that we hope will be the catalyst for other states and nations to follow?
Absolutely. I mean, in Edmonton, the support for Ukraine is extraordinarily strong, as you would expect, because of the huge diaspora community that we have. But I think what the senator had mentioned is that there is support for this idea of repurposing those assets. That's quite strong across the country. Certainly, I think when you look at our parliament, you see universal support for Ukraine within the parliament. That's not the case in every country. And I think it's important to recognize that in Canada, that has been unwavering, that support. I mean, the unanimous consent motion to declare the genocide, the work that's been done, the unanimous support for some of the work that's been done on sanctions, I think is clear. One thing I want to raise, I 100% agree that the time is of the essence here. In February, I guess, Michael and I, along with the other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, were actually in Belgium. We spoke to European leaders and what Canada was doing, and wondered what our next steps were going to be, wondered what that was going to look like. And so certainly the world is watching. They want to see us take those next steps. They want to see Canada move. I left that trip actually and went to Ukraine. To Irpin. I saw how civilian apartment buildings have been completely destroyed. I think I've described it before, but seeing a playground, a child slide shot up with bullets, could there be a stronger symbol of a clear attack on civilians, on a clear war crimes than that? So I think absolutely the will is there. I think we've got some great ideas on how to do that. The speed, I'm going to get a little partisan here, I don't think is there. I do think that at this point, our sanction regime tends to be a lot more putting people on lists and a lot less enforcement. We're undertaking a study. I know the Senate's undertaking a study. We're undertaking a study within the Foreign Affairs Committee right now that is looking at how we're actually enforcing our sanctions, and we're not. You know, the Special Economic Measures Act has not been used in over 10 years. We're not using our sanctions. So unfortunately, what you can do is you can add people to a list, you can say we're going to do certain things, but that action, the actual giving the resources to make sure that that action can be taken hasn't been done yet. And so that's my worry. Because you're right, Ukrainians want to rebuild, they want to start rebuilding right now. They need us to step up now.
Can I sort of build on that comment about sanctions? Because I think that's been sort of a almost monthly announcement. I'm sitting on the Russian list, and
We better all be.
I'm deeply despondent that I can't visit Moscow sometime in the next week or two. But nevertheless, I'm overcoming that. But I think what you're saying is that in parliamentary terms, studies have been showing that sanctions are messaging, but they're not really biting. Is this something that, as parliamentarians, you think you might be able to combine, cooperate, and say, let's see how a forfeiture program, even if it's the first 100 million from Abramovich, but it's simply it's a signal, it's a step, it's that kind of important shot that's heard around the world. Do you think there's a capacity or willingness in the parliamentary system to both maybe take the initiative or at least support an initiative by the government in doing that? Who would?
So I take Heather's point. We're not acting as quickly as we could, but I also make the point that the government committed $76 million to strengthening global affairs capacity in actioning the sanctions. I should also note, just for the audience, that what's unique about our legislation, in which we must promote as we go into the world, is that it's not country specific. It is not specific to the Ukraine, because there are other bad actors. Right. And in fact, it is the Iranian diaspora that is organizing just as vibrantly as the Ukrainian diaspora to call the government to account for allowing dirty, rotten Iranian money to take seed in our country and provide a lifestyle to people who have impinged on the human rights of their country people. So I think I see things a little bit more positively, but I do believe Canada's role in this is specific. It's not necessarily to have the biggest bang for the biggest dollar. That will come from the EU and the UK, where the greatest amount of state assets are held. Our role is to show the path forward, to provide protection in a way for others who will come after us, and use the measures that we have used, adapt them to their own jurisdiction, because there are different jurisdictions with different issues. So I'll just note the EU, and Belgium, since it was spoken about, is very interested. They have a large euro holding from Russia, and they at this point are using the interest from the frozen assets and have handed over, I believe, $200 million to the Ukraine recently, just as interest derived from those assets without liquidating them. I think the irreversibility argument is something that we could talk at length about.
Alexandra, you wanted to involve.
I just wanted to build on something the senator mentioned, and that's the Iranian mobilization of the community. The survivors of the crash of the flight PS752 have recently hit an impediment in the courts where the State Immunity Act was invoked to prevent execution of the judgment against Iranian state assets. I know that case is being appealed now, but that is could be a perfect precedent-setting case for the Ukrainian case. And I know that we have offered as much support as we can to council for that action. But I think we also need to find more. We tend to look upon Canada as a small country and a small market. And Michael and I had this conversation just yesterday, and I don't want to steal your thunder on the beneficial ownership registries. We don't really know. It's a self-reporting system right now. We don't really know how much money is hidden here. And it is incumbent upon us to find that money. And if we can't get it done through, well, a registry will take a long time, but there are many very competent forensic accountants in this country who could be engaged to help find those funds.
Michael, where is this idea right now? I mean, you've been pushing the back.
Yeah. So the government's introduced Bill C-42, which is a bill that's making its way through Parliament that will create a federal beneficial ownership registry. By way of context, we have a challenge in Canada with money laundering, which is related to sanctions enforcement, because if you can't identify the beneficial owner of money, if you can't identify the beneficial owner of an asset, real property, or trust, then you really can't enforce sanctions. And we've become a significant haven for money laundering. The US State Department, in its 2022 report on narcotics money laundering, has estimated that between 50 and $100 billion Canadian is being laundered through our country every year. So federal government's introduced legislation to do it. The challenge with the legislation is this: it only applies to companies incorporated under the Canada Business Corporations Act, of which there are about 430,000 companies in Canada. There are a total of 4.3 million companies in Canada. Ergo, 3.9 million are incorporated under the 10 provincial statutes of 10 provincial governments. The other challenge is that it does not include real estate. And the Cullen Commission in British Columbia identified real estate as a significant destination for money laundering. So it's a good first start, but it needs to be strengthened so that all federal and provincially incorporated entities, plus real estate and trusts, have a beneficial ownership registry. And that then in turn will allow us to trace and track Russian oligarchs who have been sanctioned, and state assets that are here that we may not be aware of.
Does this get us into the third rail of Canadian politics called provincial federal relations and how you organize it?
But the criminal code is broad, wide, and deep.
All right, okay. Brian.
Yeah, and I know when I talk to Minister Joly regularly about this, I think they're actively doing what they can. As Senator Ahmedvar mentioned, there's an urgency there, and they've added resources. I think it's harder than we think to identify, and I think a forensic audit is a really good idea, and having a registry of Russian assets in the country that we could disclose and would be good. But I actually think it comes down to resources. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and I don't think it's quite as easy to identify those assets as we might sit here and think. If there are additional measures that and ideas that people have, I would welcome bringing those forward to our government and our cabinet.
Well, I mean, realistically, we look at the US and they have, hundreds of people that are working on sanction enforcement. We have 7. I mean, when you talk about resources, the resources we need are people to be actually looking into these things and finding out where these assets are being held, and we don't have that happening. So of course it's great that the 76 million has been announced. My argument back to the senator would be that 2023 is a little late for that 76 million, especially if this is a cornerstone of our foreign policy, particularly with regards to conflict zones. So realistically, we brought in people from the RCMP, from the CBSA, and we were told that it's not really a priority for them. They've got other things. They don't have the resources. They don't have the staff. They don't have the time. They don't have the things allocated. I do feel a bit like a Debbie Downer here, but it's June and it's hard to be a parliamentarian in June. So that's my excuse.
I can't wait for the next question period. I've just been told that we would like to move in our remaining time for some response from our guests and friends here. So we're going to open it up, and it includes also the presentations of those on the first panel, those of you who may have challenges or so. And I see a hand, young lady right at the back. Would you also tell us your name? And I think we have a mic for you. Just shows how fast you can get there.
I feel like I made you walk all the way to the other side of the room. I'm so sorry. So I had a question for the panelists here and for the previous presentation where we talked about making sure that money, support, and resources gets to the right people and the most vulnerable people. There was a recent announcement of the Government of Canada partnering with the Rainbow Railroad, and I'm wondering what sort of opportunities you see now that that partnership, for those of you who don't know, the Rainbow Railroad has now been made on par with UNHCR in terms of identifying refugees who are from the LGBTQ plus community around the world, and what opportunities you see within this crisis of working with that sort of organization to, again, to the previous speaker, get to the people who need the support, as a lot of you said, right now, immediately, to get the support that they need. Thank you.
So anybody on this panel, or we can ask Allison if she wants to respond to that. Allison?
I think some priority must be given to victims of sexual assault.
Right.
And I would support a priority or a special intervention that is ahead of its time in terms of getting everything done right and the P's and Q's crossed, because we know process kills everything. But I would support an intervention that started to flow funds to victims of sexual violence.
If I could share with you, one of the another initiative through the council is we set up a task force for the Americas, which brought together a very broad base of civil societies, religious organizations, former practitioners. It was chaired by a former president from Costa Rica. What was one of the most sort of severe and chastening comment was just how presently, with the movements coming out of the Iron Triangle, that every 20 or 30, 40 miles, there is a stopping point, and that the price, as they say, for crossing that for a family is give me your daughter. And so the level of sexual exploitation that's taking place, and it's not being monitored, it's not being responded. And one of the things we're trying to work with, and we've talked to sort of officials in the government, is to provide a new pathway in which, for those who have been, there already is one for women and girls coming out of the camps in Jordan and Greece. We're now trying to see if we can do something in the Americas the same way. But there's an area itself which I think sort of implodes the whole idea, because it's just got so much danger and result, but also one in which there can be a very high degree of Canadian community involvement in coming to grips with that. So I just share that with you, that this is a very common issue. But Ryan, you wanted to comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I think we have to look at this through an intersectional lens. I think we have to understand the layers and levels of vulnerability that people are facing as a result of fleeing violence and violent situations. And I think I like the presentation earlier that talked about the social impact and looking at, you know, how we support people from those various segments of the communities to you know, really through a social justice lens, and to make sure that we're responding to those needs accordingly. So I think you know, we can be very innovative and work collectively to do that. And I think there's quite a few opportunities to do that, both in supporting refugees that are here in Canada, but also ensuring that they can return to Ukraine as we mobilize the capital and use the assets needed to rebuild.
Thank you. Heather, did you want to?
Well, just really quickly, the announcement on support for the Rainbow Railroad is phenomenal. First of all, it's really spectacular, and I'm delighted that that is happening. And it is support for those who are most vulnerable, and that goes along with our law, with the ODA Accountability Act that says that we need to take in the perspectives of those most vulnerable. I mean, that is the law in Canada, that's what we prioritize those who are most in need. It would be perfect to make sure that we are continuing to support those who are most vulnerable. And Ukraine is one place, but certainly we've seen recently Uganda, other places around the world where LGBTQ2+ rights are at risk.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo basically what's been said thus far. I think the importance of trying to set up a fund today is to actually address some of those needs now and not wait until we are back on the ground in the Ukraine. So what can be done today is supporting good groups like Rainbow Railroad. I know them quite well and the work that they do. And I think that's I guess the question on the table is, how can we take advantage of some of those funds right now and put them to good use for the most vulnerable?
Okay, other questions? Oh, from the embassy. Senator. Oh, Mary Lou, how are you?
Hi, Lloyd. Good to see you. Good to see you in person.
Yeah.
I'm Mary Lou McPhedran, and I want to thank my sister, Senator Ratna, for all of the hard work on this and for the kind of cross-parliamentary cooperation that we've been doing. But my question relates much more to Alexandra's area, which is civil society. And my question is about the actual decision-making model for the allocation of resources. And this is a shift beyond being sensitive, having talk about support and victims, but rather moving to a position of agency around the actual decision-making of the allocation of resources. And my question is about the model. How deeply are we already into that agency in thinking about how the allocation of resources will actually take place?
Well, I think it's important to remember that this has to be a global effort. Canada can certainly take certain steps, but it must be in concert with the global community, because Canada alone isn't going to do this. And it has to harmonize with what the ultimate global effort is going to look like. Much like the Marshall Fund after World War II, I think that's what we're looking at here. And so Canada can certainly, in terms of the fund that Allison is talking about, I'm sure that you have consulted with your partners in other countries who will be taking the lead here.
Okay, other questions? Dmitry.
Andriy Bukovich, Embassy of Ukraine. Last May, the cabinet introduced legislative changes to Refugee and Immigration Protection Act, aimed to prevent the entry or issuing of visa to nationals who are under sanctions within the Special Economic Measures Act. If I'm not mistaken, the last debates on these changes were in December 2022. When we can expect that those who are on sanctions list of Canada would be banned from entering or getting permanent residence in Canada? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, the Minister of Immigration already has the power to ban individuals from entering Canada who are on the sanctions list. The legislation that's being proposed would just make that explicit in the act. So it's not in practice going to be a huge change. The issue, frankly, is more of interdepartmental information sharing than it is of legislation. You know, the chief of police of the Tehran police force was allowed to come to Canada to work out a good life in Richmond Hill, terrorizing members of the Persian community about a year and a half ago. Obviously, there was a lack of information sharing about this individual amongst departments and agencies. That should not have happened. So I think it's less a question of legislation, more a question of information sharing.
That legislation hasn't passed yet. It's being debated for the third time tomorrow, I believe. Stay tuned to CPAC.
Okay, we have a few more minutes before we open the bar, and not that I have any interest in that. Oh, yes, Sabine, yes.
Thank you. Just a quick comment. People who are talking about trust funds, Alison, you, for example, and Mr. Turnbull, have you looked at the International Criminal Court's Trust Fund for Victims? It's a model both of good things, they have done some good things, and of how not to try and do things. So that, I think, would be something that you might want to look at in terms of setting up your own ideas and your own structures. And in that context as well, Mr. Turnbull, there was an attempt about 3 or 4 years ago to create a peace bond for the ICC, particularly for the Trust Fund of Victims. I think one of the leaders was David Sheffer, former US war crimes ambassador. And you may want to talk with him if you haven't already as well, because I think that experiment didn't quite work. And he might again have some very useful lessons for you there. Thanks. So not a question as much as a suggestion.
No,
Yeah, thank you for that.
that's
Maybe-
very helpful, thank you.
Lloyd, can I just respond to that really quick?
Sure.
Yeah, just really quick. Really great suggestion. David Sheffer has been involved in the work that we've been doing from the beginning. He's the one that really originated or initiated the concept initially. So we have been speaking with him regularly. And the previous comment you made, I think, is a really good case to look at and an example. And I haven't looked at it to date, but maybe we could engage you in informing us a little bit more about that in the Social Innovation Caucus, if you're willing.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Michael, do you want?
Maybe I'll just make a general comment. I think the reality is that the vast majority of assets that are needed to rebuild Ukraine are going to be Russian state assets. If you add up the totality of all the oligarchs and their boats, their yachts, their shares, their other assets, their property, it pales in comparison to Russian state assets. So that's the first point. Second point is seizing private assets, particularly of individuals who have not been sanctioned, is a challenge. So I think the reality is if we're going to rebuild Ukraine with Russian money, it's got to be with Russian state assets, largely held in euros, largely in Brussels, London, some of it in Japanese yen and Japan, and pound sterling in London. And the second final point I'll make is that time is of the essence. Russia actually has a perverse incentive right now to continue the war. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the Russian GDP's barely been affected. They've not had an out-migration of a third of their population. And they're selling lots of oil and gas around the world. For every $100,000 shell they lob at an apartment building in Ukraine, they're costing us $10 million. So they actually have a perverse incentive to continue the war, unless we start signaling now that pot of money, that $10 million for each apartment building, isn't coming out of our pocket, it's coming out of their state assets. And then they actually have an incentive to stop the war. We have to make sure, though, that in doing that, we don't allow them to play the game of, well, we'll have a ceasefire so we can regroup and then, start another assault. So time is of the essence here, and it has to be focused on Russian state assets.
Yeah, I'm actually, because our time is now sort of shrinking, ask each of the panelists here if you have some final sort of soliloquy or comment or recommendation that you'd like to make before we finish. Heather, do you want to start? Do you feel up to, right?
Well, I'm certainly in agreement with my colleague MP Chong that the Russian state assets are really where we need to move. I think we really need to work in concert with our international allies. If we're truly going to do that, of course, we know that Canada doesn't have a lot of those state assets, but I think setting the precedent and showing leadership is what Canada really has to offer. And I really feel strongly that that we have the will, the political will, and the public will is there in Canada. Thus, we have really no reason not to advance forward and inspire the international community to do the same.
Well, that's a great affirmation. Heather.
Yeah, I think you've heard from all of us that we recognize that the time urgency of this, that you recognize that this is doable, that this is something we can move forward on. I guess what I would add to that is that this is a portion of the things that Canada needs to be doing right now. There are other things that we can be doing. We need to be making sure that we're supporting the ICC and the ICJ. We need to make sure that we are helping with demining. You know, the ecocide that we are seeing with the explosion with the recent dam, the demining in the country is going to take decades. It's going to take a long time, and Canada has expertise there. You know, we need to be contributing, aside from these assets, we need to be contributing ODA to Ukraine, but we need to be doing it in a way that doesn't come at the cost of other countries around the world. That doesn't cost some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that require that support, that it doesn't cost them. So we really do have to be thoughtful about how we do this.
I'm going to make a really outside. You hit a certain sort of nerve, and we had talked about mining.
That's right.
Because I had a certain involvement.
A certain
with
involvement.
A treaty about them.
Yeah.
And I was going to tell you, over the years, we have allowed our capacity on demining to shrink and get smaller and smaller. Rebuilding that, particularly with the kind of challenge, I think they've said that almost 1/3 of agricultural land in Ukraine has now been corrupted.
Yeah. And they have
18-year-old
kids that are demining those fields right now.
Huh? Yeah,
without any support. Well, and then that brings up nuclear disarmament too. I mean, there's a lot of things we could be working on.
You know, we have a certain vocation that I think goes back 25 years. Senator.
I know that sanctions work best when we don't walk that path alone, that when others follow in or walk alongside us. So I think that is most important for us to do, is to walk that path and bring others along as they are already coming along. I do believe that for the Canadian context, there are two different paths. One is seizing and repurposing oligarch assets, where we can use SEMA and Magnitsky. And then the other is state assets. And I'm really interested in Professor Curry's proposal to amend the Sovereign Act. You know, I'm a practical legislator. I'm going to be talking to him about flesh this out, write this out. We'll find someone to do it, because I think that will get in the way. And not that we have state assets to talk about. I've actually heard that there is really a couple of $100 left here. But that's not the point. The point is to carve out the path and make it possible for others to follow.
Michael?
Yeah, my final thought is that we should take a page from your book. I think it was 25 years ago that you led the initiative to create a global anti-mine treaty. And, you know, we're still talking about those issues in Parliament 25 years later, and you did it by, you know, using Canada's good reputation to get like-minded countries together to start talking about this. And I think in a similar vein, I think we should do the same thing at the G7. The G7 is our most important multilateral organization that we are a member of. And it also happens to be the 7 countries where almost all of the $300 billion in assets are. We've got the Japanese yen, we've got the Eurozone area, we've got the pound sterling, and we have the US dollar. And so we can, I think, at that forum, really start to lead the charge on this. And I think that's where the government of Canada should take the initiative.
Right. Alexandra.
Thank you. I
You
think
do the salutation.
that there is so much talent in Canada that we have not yet tapped. Much of that talent is sitting in this room today, but we have mental health professionals who can help. Senator Kuchar is a psychiatrist who is very interested in helping on that huge problem that Ukraine now has. We have Louise Arbour, who is one of the few jurists who has actually prosecuted a genocide. And if we could persuade her to take on one more mission, we would do ourselves proud. But I want to end by thanking everyone here. And I have said this many times before, but It makes the pain of Ukrainians so much lighter, knowing that good Canadians are coming to our aid. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we'll sort of close off, and Fen can give the salutation. Before he goes, I just want to share with you, I think, the right kind of axiom for maybe today's discussion, and the underlying force of urgency we've heard comes from Charles Taylor. His book, Secular Age, he says, never has any generation been so stretched to meet the needs of strangers at the gate. I think that's where we're at. Thank you all very much for your participation.
I want to thank all of our panelists, especially our members of parliament. It's a very busy week, and not only did you all show up, but you had some terrific things to say. So thank you very much. You're all invited to a reception right now, right here. There's Prosecco and hors d'oeuvres that will be coming immediately. And please feel free to speak to our guests.